Good afternoon. My name is Matt Zwolinski, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's debate on behalf of the Universities of San Diego's Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy. This is the first of two debates that the Center will be holding during the 2018-2019 academic year. And I'd encourage all of you who are interested to sign up for our mailing list at the URL indicated on the PowerPoint there if you're interested in keeping informed about future events by the Center. We hold two debates a year. We also hold a number of small panel discussions on topics such as Trump's international trade policy and tax reform. There's also a link on the PowerPoint to a survey where you can tell us what you thought about today's events, give us any suggestions for future events or ways to improve. Each of our debates here at the Center is driven by a belief in the vital importance of conversation, especially conversation with people with whom you strongly disagree. In a time of increasing political polarization, it's all too easy to write off one's political opponents as ignorant or even evil without ever taking the time to actually listen to what they have to say. But without conversation, our minds remain a closed system, and the possibility of intellectual growth is forestalled. Through conversation, we open the possibility of learning, maybe to learning that our position was mistaken and that we should change our mind. But at the very least, learning what the other side has to say and how to rethink our own position for the better in light of that insight. The topic of today's debate is gun control. It has been just over a year since Stephen Paddock opened fire at the Harvest Music Festival in Las Vegas, killing 58 people in the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. It's just been a little over 8 months since the shooting at a high school in Parkland, Florida, took the lives of 17 more people. 6 of the 10 deadliest shootings in U.S. history have occurred during the last 10 years, and thousands of other lives are lost each year to firearms through suicide, accidents, and criminal assault. Does America need stricter gun control laws? That is the topic of tonight's debate. Would stricter gun laws save innocent lives, or would such restrictions infringe upon the rights of gun owners, the vast majority of whom, after all, are not criminal, thereby depriving them not only of a useful tool for hunting and recreation, but, more significantly, for defending their lives and their property against criminal aggression? These are difficult and challenging questions that are too often buried in ideological and partisan politics. To help us think clearly about them and to begin the process of open, honest, and respectful dialogue that our democracy so desperately needs, we have two eminently qualified scholars with us tonight. Michael Huemer is professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado. He is the author of more than 60 academic articles in epistemology, ethics, metaethics, metaphysics, and political philosophy, as well as 6 books, including The Problem of Political Authority, Approaching Infinity, and most recently, Paradox Lost. Several of these books are on sale in the lobby if you are interested. Michael Shermer is Presidential Fellow at Chapman University, the publisher of Skeptic magazine, and the New York Times bestselling author of 5 books, including Why People Believe Weird Things, The Moral Arc, and most recently, Heavens on Earth, the scientific search for the afterlife, immortality, and utopia. And Dr. Shermer's books are also available for us outside. Before we begin tonight's debate, I want to thank the Institute for Humane Studies for sponsoring tonight's debate. I want to thank the University of San Diego for its support of the center and our activities. And I want to give special thanks to Malin Burnham, one of the founding supporters of the center, for all his great work in supporting the city of San Diego in general and our institution in particular. Thank you, Malin. So without any further ado, let's begin tonight's conversation with Michael Huemer.
All right, testing. Okay, good. Thanks for that generous introduction. All right, so I'm going to talk about gun control laws and the right to bear arms. Michael Shermer and I have not seen each other's presentations, so I don't know exactly what he's going to say. So I'm going to just give sort of a generic discussion of problems with gun control and the right to own a gun. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two main things. There are two main kinds of problems that apply to most gun control laws that people are talking about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is gun rights. That is, the problem that restrictions on gun ownership might be violating the rights of individual gun owners, in particular their right to defend themselves. And it makes the state something like an accomplice to crime. And the second main problem is the non-compliance problem. This is a problem that gun control laws are frequently ineffective because the people that they're aimed at restricting will not follow them. So the laws will simply fail to have their intended effect. Okay, and now, of course, the picture there in the corner is to show you how cute gun ownership can be. All right, what about this gun rights issue? All right, so I'm going to start with hypothetical examples. So these are hypothetical examples that I discussed in a published article back in 2003. So imagine there are three people in this example. There's a person who we will call the victim, and another person called the killer, and another person called the accomplice. The victim is sitting in his house at night when the killer breaks into the house and is going to kill the victim. The accomplice is somebody who's in the house for whatever reason, and for whatever reason, the accomplice holds the victim down while the killer comes and then stabs the victim to death. All right, question, what is the correct moral assessment of this action by the accomplice? So obviously, the killer committed one of the most serious crimes, or maybe the most serious crime that we have, but what about the accomplice? And I want you to have the intuitive reaction that, well, the accomplice performed an action that was comparable to that of the killer. The accomplice performed a serious wrong, which is about as wrong as actually killing the victim. It might be slightly less bad, but it's comparable. All right, here's a second example. Like the previous example, except this time, the victim has a gun, which the victim would use to defend himself against the killer, except that the accomplice grabs it and runs away just before the victim is able to do that. So, and the result is that the victim is then killed by the killer. Question, what is the moral status of the accomplice's action in this case? And you're supposed to have the intuitive reaction that that is like the previous case, right? It's another case in which the accomplice prevented the victim from defending himself, and that is morally comparable to actually being the killer. It's maybe slightly less bad than actually being the killer, but you know, it's kind of on a par. All right, here's a third example. There's a citizen who wants to own a gun for self-defense purposes, and if able to, would use a gun to defend himself against crimes, but the government either stops the citizen from getting the gun in the first place or takes the gun away from the citizen, with the result that the citizen is unable to defend himself on some actual occasion when a criminal comes and then is victimized by the crime. What would we think of the state's action in this case? And the intuitive reaction that you're supposed to have is, well, that's similar to the previous two examples, actually. The state prevented the person from defending themselves and thereby became something like an accomplice to the criminal. The state's action there is maybe slightly less bad than actually killing citizens, but it's not a lot less bad, right? And so the argument here is going to be that the state, by enacting gun control laws, makes itself an accomplice to crime. That is, it does something that's morally comparable to actually committing multiple robberies, rapes, assaults, and murders. So this is my argument. A nice graphic in the corner there is from King of the Hill, the hilarious cartoon. Okay, so my argument, first premise, gun control laws coercively prevent some individuals from defending themselves against crimes. There are some people who, if able, would use a gun to defend themselves against crimes, and gun control laws will typically result in some people not doing so who would have done so. And coercively preventing someone from defending themselves against a crime is seriously wrong. Specifically, it's morally on a par with actually committing the crime. So the conclusion is that gun control laws typically are seriously wrong, specifically that they're morally comparable to the state committing multiple murders, robberies, rapes, and assaults. All right, now, does that mean that they could never be justified? Well, so the claim there is that the government is violating people's rights if it prevents them from defending themselves with a gun. And these are further hypothetical examples that are supposed to illustrate points about the nature of rights and the way rights work. So this is to illustrate a point about violating people's rights in order to help somebody else. So this is a well-known hypothetical example in the ethics literature. Say that there's a town in which a crime has been committed that caused a lot of public outrage. And the judge, it's a sheriff. The sheriff of the town can't find the actual criminal. But he believes that unless somebody is punished for this crime, there are going to be riots in which multiple innocent people are going to be injured unjustly, of course. So the sheriff comes up with a plan. He can frame an innocent person and get that person to be punished for the crime, and that will prevent the riots. And just accept that that's true, okay? Just accept for the purpose of the example that that would prevent the riots. What should the sheriff do? Should he frame the innocent person? Most people have the intuitive reaction, which I think you should have, that no, he should not do that. That would be unjust. Why? Because it's a violation of the rights of the innocent individual. And what this illustrates is that it's not morally permissible to violate an individual's rights, even if doing so prevents a greater harm to other individuals, right? It could be preventing a harm to several other individuals that would be comparable to the harm that you would commit, but it would still be wrong, because that's the way rights work, because your moral responsibility is to not violate other people's rights. Right? Your moral responsibility is not to fix every problem in the world. It's first of all to make sure that you yourself do not violate other people's rights. Okay, now, that doesn't mean that it's never permissible to violate an individual's rights. So there are hypothetical examples people like to talk about in which somehow killing an innocent person prevents World War III, in which case you should kill the innocent person. There are some possible conditions, right? But what these examples illustrate is that at the very least, it has to be that violating the individual's rights prevents a much greater harm. It can't just be preventing a slightly greater harm or just a few times, right? It can't just be that you're saving a few people. It would have to be very large harm. Okay. So conclusions here. It's wrong to violate an individual's rights even to prevent a greater but comparable benefit, even to produce a greater comparable benefit for others. It might be justified to do it to produce a benefit that's many times greater. So gun control laws are wrong even if they would prevent greater but comparable harm to others. They might be justified, but only if they prevented many times as much harms as they caused. Okay. So now we have to consider sort of the costs and benefits of private gun ownership. In the empirical literature on this, one of the main things people talk about is the frequency of defensive gun uses. So how often do people use a gun for self-defense in the United States? There's a wide range of estimates. So you can get estimates between 55,000 times per year and 4.7 million times per year, right? Number of times that a person used a gun to defend themselves against a crime. It's weird that the estimates are so widely varying, so we don't know, with much accuracy at all. The most cited estimate is by Gary Kleck of around 2.5 million per year. And the average estimate is somewhere around 3 million or something. The low estimates are by the National Crime Victimization Survey. This is a non-anonymous survey which is conducted by the Justice Department. So there could be a bias, a downward bias, because you may not want to talk to the chief law enforcement agency of the government about something that you did that could even conceivably be considered to be illegal. When they have your contact information, they have your name and your address. You may not want to tell them. The high estimates of defensive gun ownership, of defensive gun uses per year imply that they're significantly more common than actual gun crimes. Right? So it's quite possible that private gun ownership prevents more crime than it causes. Another thing that people commonly talk about is concealed weapons. So there are studies of this, the effect of allowing people to carry concealed weapons. There was a famous study by John Lott, which suggested that having more permissive laws for carrying concealed weapons reduced crime. Now, that was subsequently disputed by a bunch of people. So it's under debate whether it actually reduces crime. It might have no effect. It depends upon sort of assumptions that you make. There was a review of the evidence by the National Research Council, part of the National Academy of Sciences in 2005, which is, by the way, not a partisan report at all. Their report is very even-handed and basically says, well, the results are kind of sensitive to what assumptions you make, and there's no clear consensus on the effect of these laws, right? Basically, you can have more and less restrictive laws for whether you're allowed to carry concealed weapons or what you have to do to be allowed. Okay, so the conclusion is, well, it's not exactly known, right? There is evidence on both sides for both of these kinds of laws. That means that it really does not satisfy the requirement of preventing much greater harm than it causes, right? It's quite possible that gun laws cause greater harm than they prevent. Okay, I'm going on to the second major problem with most gun control laws. It's the non-compliance problem. And as you can see, the graphic in the corner there makes non-compliance look really cute. But in many cases, in reality, it's not so cute, right? So you have to distinguish between debating guns and debating gun laws. The topic for us isn't are guns good or bad? The topic is about gun laws. And you have to separate those two things because laws frequently do not have their intended effects, and they also frequently have additional unintended effects, which could be harmful. Having a law that says nobody is allowed to do X doesn't mean that actually nobody does X, right? Now, this is a point that most people are able to understand if you pick the right examples. So most people on the political left can see my point if I talk about the drug laws. And the question about whether the drug laws are a good idea is quite different from the question of whether drugs are good. Whether drugs are good doesn't tell us whether the drug laws are good. And in fact, largely because of the non-compliance problem, because a huge number of people don't follow the laws, there are very large costs to those laws, and they don't really achieve their intended effect. So if you see that point, and that it's important to sort of distinguish are drugs good from are the laws good, then you should also be able to see this point. It's really important to distinguish are guns good or bad for us from are the gun laws good or bad. Okay, reasons why there might be a significant compliance problem with gun laws in particular. So obviously, this isn't a reason for not having any laws. Like, obviously, there are plenty of laws that there's substantial compliance with, and they have much greater benefits than costs. So, you should ask, well, what about the gun laws in particular? Are there special reasons why there would be a big non-compliance problem? Yes, there are. So one is that in the United States, there's a very large gun culture, which if you're not part of it, you probably don't quite appreciate. But there's a very large number of Americans who have guns, a large number who love them and have no intention of ever giving them up, right? And a large number of people for whom this is a major part of their lifestyle is like going out shooting or hunting or whatever. There are somewhere around 300 million guns in the United States, which is approaching the number of actual people in the United States and is larger than the number of adults. Guns are very durable objects, which means that even if production completely stopped right now, 50 years from now, there would still be 300 million guns in the United States, right? So all of this makes it like really problematic to try to get rid of them if you wanted to. And then the final problem is gun laws are specifically aimed at criminals. This is not true of most laws. That is, most laws prohibit something that is intrinsically bad. The gun laws are aimed specifically at restricting the behavior of people who would already independently be criminals. That is, you want to take the guns away from criminals. You don't want to take them away from just ordinary people. Roughly speaking, there are two kinds of reasons that you might want a gun. There are criminal reasons and non-criminal reasons. The criminal reasons are you want a gun so you can go and kill somebody or rob somebody or whatever. You want it so that you can commit some other crime, not a gun crime, right? Something that's already illegal, even if you didn't have a gun. And then there are non-criminal reasons, like you want to defend yourself, or you want to go out shooting on the weekends, or you're a hunter, or whatever, or you just think they're cool, right? Okay, which are basically innocent reasons. And the purpose of having the gun laws is specifically to get guns away from the criminals. in order to make it harder for them to commit other crimes. And you don't want to take them away from the ordinary law-abiding citizens, right? The problem, though, is it's really hard to get criminals to follow laws. So, and the thing is, like, most of the gun restrictions that people talk about, if enacted, they would be misdemeanors, right? So, like, buying a kind of gun that you're not allowed to buy, or if you're a person who's not allowed to buy the gun, right, it would be a misdemeanor. And the crimes that we're trying to stop the people from committing would be felonies. People who are likely to commit a felony to begin with are also not likely to be, they're not likely to stop at committing a misdemeanor gun law violation, right? So like if I was gonna go commit a murder, I'm probably not gonna think, oh no, wait, but then I would be violating a gun law. So, right. Now you might think, oh yeah, well, but it will slightly increase the punishment, right? Because, you know, you'll get a couple more years because you committed the crime with a gun. Yeah, but if that was your point, just increase the punishment for the original crime, right? But the laws are likely to affect the behavior of ordinary non-criminal citizens, right? So if you want the gun for a non-criminal purpose, it's likely that you will obey gun restriction laws. If you want a gun for a criminal purpose, it's most likely that you will not obey them, which means that the actual effect of the gun laws is likely to be the opposite of the intended effect. What you want is for the criminals to not have guns, but everybody else should be allowed to have them. But what will actually happen is the reverse. The criminals will continue to have guns, or, you know, the kind of gun that they're not supposed to have, and then ordinary citizens will give them up. Right. Okay, that was the main non-compliance problem. Okay, this is just some further reading. As you can see, you know, there are many hilarious variants on the NRA's slogan there: "Guns don't kill people, George R.R. Martin kills people." If you're a Game of Thrones fan, then you understood that. Okay, anyway, this is some further reading that I recommend. There's an article that I had from 2003 from the journal Social Theory and Practice, Is There a Right to Own a Gun? And then there was a shorter, more popular essay called Gun Rights and Non-Compliance. Both of these are available on my website. So, and if you just go to the website, you can see links to a bunch of papers and things. That third item is the National Research Council study that I referred to earlier. And I want to say sort of like generally, if you form an opinion on a controversial issue, you really do kind of have to read from both sides. You need to listen to both sides, and you need to listen to not like, I don't mean popular sources, I don't mean blog posts or like op-eds in newspapers or whatever. Usually the best things are sort of academic, which means also that they're less entertaining, okay, which is why most people don't read them. But anyway, the National Research Council survey is very even-handed. It's not like a pro-gun thing. They're not a pro-gun organization by any stretch, nor are they an anti-gun organization, right? And they just did a, you know, they just have this survey of the research that's been done, which is why I recommend that. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, if I can have my slides up and the slide clicker. Welcome and thanks for having me, and really appreciate it. This is an important debate, obviously. I'm the publisher of, well, they're bringing my slides up here, the Skeptic magazine. I brought enough. Hopefully I shipped down a couple cases for everybody. We did an issue of Skeptic on gun control after the Sandy Hook massacre, just to kind of look at the science behind what we know about guns and gun control. And you know, we're a science-based organization devoted to investigating any and all kinds of controversial claims. So, and should I send out my telepathic psychic powers to bring my slides up? Normally I could just give a talk off the top of my head, but it's kind of a data-heavy presentation here. And so just to kind of put it on the table here, I'm not anti-gun either. Neither Michael or I are, you know, a couple of right-wing gun nuts, nor are we far-left tree-hugging, wishy-washy, namby-pamby, bedwetting liberals afraid of guns. I grew up with BB guns and pellet guns and a 20-gauge shotgun and a 12-gauge shotgun. My stepfather was a hunter. So I spent years hunting birds, and we ate the birds. So I guess that makes it sort of okay. And then as an adult, I had, let's see, wherever that went to. I hope I didn't turn it off. Oh, there we go. Okay, let's get that. Yeah, and I had a handgun, a Ruger, for 20 years as an adult. And basically, when my daughter got to be a teenager and had friends coming over, I thought it wasn't such a good idea, even with lock boxes and all that, so I got rid of it. I've shot guns. They're very visceral. If you've never shot a gun, it's no laughing matter. It's not just an intellectual exercise in talking about statistics. I mean, you can really seriously harm and kill people with guns. So from my perspective, I want to treat guns and gun laws as a problem to be solved. That is, the problem is there's more people die by guns than die by cars every year. 2016 is the last year we have 37,000 people died by gun. This is primarily homicide and suicide, more suicides than homicides. As a little sidebar, most people who kill themselves are themselves not really sure why they do it. And so oftentimes they don't really mean it. It's just sort of a cry for help, which pills can allow you to recover from, guns not so much. And if we compare these figures to the number of Americans who died by terrorism since 2004, the terrorism numbers are on the bottom there. They're just minuscule. And if you look at like just since 9/11 or going all the way back, just think about the comparison of people that are pro-gun, that want to defend gun rights, to those same people, mostly conservatives, who are obsessed about growing the government to protect us from terrorism, right? These are the numbers that are in the statistical noise compared to gun deaths. Conservatives think of nothing of suspending civil rights and ramping up big government intrusion into our private lives in the name of homeland security over numbers that are not even in the statistical noise compared to gun deaths. If over 30,000 people died annually from terrorism in the United States, the equivalent of over 10 9/11s every year, conservatives would declare a national emergency, quadruple the national defense budget, and suspend the Constitution, except for the Second Amendment, of course. Michael wrote in his 2003 paper, which I highly recommend you read. It's quite good, and it's quite fair, and there are also some good and fair critiques of it as well, because he gets into the weeds of the statistics on gun control. Rights function to guard individuals' autonomy, that is, their ability to pursue their plans for their own lives, rather than to protect their interests as assessed from a third-person point of view. I thought I would just throw in this as a sidebar. Therefore, if you're pro-gun, you must also be pro-choice on the abortion issue because of the prima facie right of a woman's autonomy to pursue their plans for their own lives rather than to protect their interests in their bodies as assessed from a third-person point of view. In other words, blue-nosed, censorious conservatives. Okay, I'm just getting a little extra dig in there. We've got to be consistent about our moral philosophy if we're going to do this. So I'm a skeptic. Skeptics debunk myths. We're the original mythbusters. Let's take a look at some myths about guns. Myth number one, the Second Amendment to the Constitution protects us against tyranny. As the famous wording is, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, in 1776, that made a lot of sense because the military weapon of choice was the same as the private weapon of choice. Today, it's not quite the same. You cannot own your own private tank or a land surface-to-air missile or a drone that can strike with missiles. Not to mention nuclear weapons. You're already restricted by the government. Your rights to own these weapons to defend yourself are already restricted. So we're not talking about, just everybody should have everything that they want. If the special forces came to your home and you think you're going to stop them with your handgun or rifle, you're delusional. Do you know these guys? These are bad dudes, to quote our president. Special forces, Navy SEALs, if the feds come to your house, you're not going to protect yourself with your guns. You're not. Now, I'm not suggesting, again, I agree with Michael that we just confiscate every gun in America. It would be Waco and Ruby Ridge every weekend. Okay, that's not going to happen. But we already agree to restricting certain weapons. Myth number 2, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, as famously said by Wayne LaPierre of the NRA. In other words, the NRA's solution to crime and violence is to arm everyone to the teeth and hope the good guys outgun the bad guys. In essence, it's saying America is a lawless society in which criminals run the show, so everyone is on their own. Arm them all and let God sort it out later, as the country western Texas song says. If the good guys are well-armed and professionally trained military and police who routinely practice at shooting ranges, then yes, this is one of the many factors in the decline of violence. If good guy means armed private citizens like these wingnuts with little or no gun training, this could not be more wrong. 2009 American Journal of Public Health study, epidemiologists at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine found that, on average, guns did not protect those who possessed them from being shot in an assault. In fact, they estimated that people with a gun were 4.5 times more likely to be shot in an assault than those not possessing a gun. There's a risk you take of having a gun in your house. There are several risks. The burglar may take your gun and shoot you with it, unless you're out there in the range practicing all the time and you know exactly where it's stored and how to get it out of your safe lockbox. You remember you use the fingerprint thing, or maybe it's the face recognition one, or maybe it's the code you forgot, and so forth. Arming everyone to the teeth as a solution to the problem of crime and violence is quite possibly the worst idea anyone has ever had. On time scales ranging from years to centuries, the decline of violence has been the result of disarming citizens and of civil society. Steven Pinker's book, The Battle Angels of Our Nature, my book, The Moral Arc, tracks this long-term trend over the centuries. A civil state with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, this is the famous definition of what we mean by a government or a state, decreases incentives for exploitative attack, reduces the need for deterrence and vengeance, replaces self-help justice with criminal justice, and replaces a culture of honor with a culture of justice. In other words, we evolved a propensity to want justice, to want wrongs to be made right. This is why we created a criminal justice system. But if the criminal justice system is broken or it doesn't work, people then take the law into their own hands because they still have the strong urge to make wrongs right. If there's guns available, that's what makes it deadly. Here's the decline of homicide rates since the 14th century in Europe, from anywhere from 35 to 40 per 100,000 as criminologists study it, down to less than 1 per 100,000 in Europe. Today, it's about 5.5 per 100,000 in America. Today, we're about 5 times higher than Europe. I'll show you why in just a moment. By the way, busting another cowboy myth, most Western towns employed gun controls to reduce violence in order to bring business and civilization out west. Here's a famous sign in Wichita, Kansas in 1873, "Leave your revolvers at police headquarters and get a check." The gunfight at the OK Corral was over gun control and the enforcement of the law. Here's a Dodge City, Kansas 1879 sign, "The carrying of firearms is strictly prohibited." Any persons or persons found carrying concealed weapons in the city of Dodge or violating the laws of the state shall be dealt with according to the law. The result of these Wild West gun control laws, in a 10-year period, total murders were 15 or 1.5 homicides per year, a dramatic decline from the rate before. In other words, more gun control, less crime. Michael made reference to John Lott's famous book, More Guns, Less Crime. I'm saying more gun control, less crime. Number 3, more guns equals less crime. John Lott's book, the U.S. crime rates are comparable to other Western countries who have few guns. In other words, compare our non-gun-related crimes. Car theft, burglary, robbery, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and adolescent fighting rates are similar to those of other high-income countries. But our homicide rates are off the charts higher. Why? Guns. Here's a guns per 100 people in different countries, and as you can see, we're almost 1 per person. Some people have no guns, like me, I have no guns, but other people have lots of guns. That makes it close to 1 per person. Here's the gun murder rates in the developed world, and there we are on the far right. Again, these numbers are just off the charts higher. This particular chart here is important. First, look at the blue. This is average non-gun homicides per 100,000 people. the rate in America is comparable to other European and Western industrialized nations. It's the green, the average gun homicides, that serves as a kind of experimental control to see what variable it is that's causing the carnage. It's the guns. Here's gun deaths by gun ownership of another study, guns per 100 people and the number of homicides per 100,000 people. We're number one, America, we rule. Yeah, sure. Here's another study, homicide, suicide, and unintentional gun deaths among 5 to 14-year-olds. This is the United States versus 25 other high-income countries. So they're going to give us a mortality rate ratio. These are non-gun homicides. So us compared to the average of 25 other Western industrialized nations, 1.7 to 1. Gun homicides, 13.2 to 1. Non-gun suicides, 1.3 to 1. Gun suicides, 7.8 to 1. And unintentional gun deaths, 10.3 to 1. In other words, it's the guns. That's the problem. Here's gun ownership versus gun deaths by state. Again, you see a nice linear relationship there between the number of guns and the number of people that die by gun. Number 4, when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. Gun control does not mean we're going to ban or outlaw all guns. Gun control does not mean you're anti-gun or you're an opponent of gun. Handguns are protected by the Second Amendment, the famous 2008 Supreme Court decision in Heller. There's been 2 actually in the 2000s. That would make it virtually impossible for that to be reversed now. So we have to face that fact. But this is not a slippery slope argument. For example, the licensing and regulation of cars does not mean only outlaws will drive cars. Police and courts need gun regulation to bar high-risk people from guns. Or else, what's the point of having a civil society based in the rule of law? By the way, conservatives are always saying, we're for the rule of law. Yeah, okay. Why don't you apply it to all areas? 1934 National Firearms Act regulating the manufacture and sale of machine guns. Did this result in only outlaws having machine guns? No. Where are today's machine gun Kellys? By the way, this was backed by the NRA. This is when the NRA was a gun safety organization rather than a political lobbyist organization. Number 5, criminals avoid armed citizens. Criminals routinely engage armed citizens, drug dealers, armed gang members. Gun deterrence doesn't work. Street gang members are 8.8 times more likely to own handguns than other youths and 19 times more likely to be homicide victims. Drug dealers are 3.7 times more likely to own a handgun and 6 times more likely to be homicide victims. It's the guns. Myth number 6, America's culture of violence. That must be it. If you saw Michael Moore's film, Bowling for Columbine, he kind of went through all these arguments. This was one of them that he leaned heavily on, which I think is busted by the fact that other Western countries watch just as many violent videos, films, and TV shows, and yet they don't have the rates even remotely close to our gun homicide rates. I wonder why. Let's put our thinking caps on. Oh yeah, they don't have guns. Number 7, guns in the home stop crime. The Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery on Injuries and Deaths Due to Firearms in the Home, 1998. Every time a gun in the home was used in a self-defense or legally justifiable shooting, there were 4 unintentional shootings, 7 criminal assaults or homicides, and 11 attempted or completed suicides. In other words, a gun is 22 times more likely to be used by a good guy against another good guy than it is by a good guy against a bad guy. Notice Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter. First shot his mom. His mother was shot by her own gun by her own family member. That's not that uncommon. That's not a good guy shooting a bad guy. So we can run through all the thought experiments you want. The victim comes in, this person does that, and isn't it his right to defend himself? Yeah, go ahead, have a gun in your house. Go for it. But you're 11 times more likely to be shot with your own gun. Just keep that in mind before you buy a gun. The same day as the Sandy Hook shooting, a Chinese man stabbed with a knife 22 children and 1 adult outside a primary school in Henan Province, China. Number of fatalities, 0. April 8, 2013, Lone Star College knife attack injuring 14 people by 20-year-old student Dylan Quick. Number of fatalities, 0. Yes, you can kill somebody with a knife, but it takes a lot more effort than it does with a gun. Number 8, the high-capacity ammunition feeding device won't work. It prohibits magazines that hold more than 10 bullets. The maximum is now 100. Adam Lanza purposely took only the high-capacity magazines with him to the elementary school. Why? Because he wanted to kill as many kids as possible in as short a time as possible. 154 rounds in under 10 minutes, resulting in 26 dead. You don't need a cartridge that holds 100 bullets if you're a hunter. You can just reload. The animals may not wait around for you, but that's part of the sport, right? If you're that into that. Tucson shooting of Gabby Giffords, Jared Loeffner used a 33-round clip in a 9mm Glock 19 semi-automatic pistol that he dropped when reloading and was stopped by 74-year-old Bill Badger, who was almost shot by a bystander, by the way. You know, you have like 1.5 seconds to decide what to do, and oftentimes people react inappropriately and people get shot. Number 9, background checks and mental health monitoring won't work. Busted, 60% of crime guns originate with only 1% of licensed gun dealers. 85% of gun dealers sell no guns traced to a crime. The ATF says the most important single source of firearms for the illegal market is still illegal traffickers who are acquiring firearms from retail outlets. So, tighten up the laws. Enforce the laws if we live in a society of laws. Intimate partner homicides account for half of all women killed. In 2010, 1,082 women and 267 men were killed by their intimate partners. 54% were by guns. Over the past 25 years, guns were involved in more intimate partner homicides than all other causes combined. When a woman is murdered, it is most likely by her intimate partner with a gun, not a stranger, as in the famous case of Oscar Pistorius, who killed his girlfriend. As an alternative to arming women against violent men, legislation can help. Data shows that in states that prohibit gun ownership by men who have received a domestic violence restraining order, gun-caused homicides of intimate female partners were reduced by 25%. Again, no, I'm not a woman. I don't know what it's like to be confronted by somebody who has twice your physical power. If you want a gun, have a gun. But just understand that there are huge risks with that, and you may get shot by your own gun. The more that you have those kinds of weapons around, the higher the risks go when tempers flare and so forth. He may know where your gun is just as well as you do. Mental illness and mass murders, more than half were committed by individuals with mental health problems who had exhibited signs noticed by family, friends, or colleagues indicative that something was wrong and that violence of some kind was possible. James Holmes amassed an arsenal of 6,295 rounds of ammunition, 2 handguns, a shotgun, an assault rifle, ballistic gear, laser sights and holsters, and tear gun canisters, all delivered to his doorstep by UPS. Thanks. No one noticed. Okay. Or Sung Cho killed 32 and wounded 17 at Virginia Tech. The Brady Act would have stopped him from buying his guns. In 2005, a Virginia judge found him to be mentally ill and a danger to himself, but the record disqualifying Cho from buying guns was not in the database checked by Virginia authorities. Okay, so again, the laws are already there. We should just employ them more actively. In conclusion, what should we do? Okay, again, our goal here is just what can we do to reduce the carnage? Again, if it was 37,000 people dead every year from terrorism, there would be a national panic. This is all anybody would talk about all day, every day on every talk show. Okay, so what we want to know is how can we, reduce the carnage from guns? 1, ban military-style assault weapons. 2, ban high-capacity magazines above 10. 3, universal background check system. 4, close the gun show loophole. 5, penalties for illegal gun trafficking. 6, ban high-risk individuals from guns convicted of violent crime, drugs, stalking, restraining orders. Ban sales to dangerously mentally ill people. And research funding on gun violence. It's not a trivial piece of information that the NRA does not want research organizations collecting data like this. Why? What's wrong with having knowledge? Because then people may not buy as many guns. And the NRA is a lobbyist group for the gun manufacturing industry. So, in conclusion, I say we can do something. We can't do everything, but as Dr. King said, even though we can't do everything, we can do something to reduce the carnage of gun violence and further bend the arc of the moral universe to justice, peace, and freedom. Thank you.
Okay, so at this point in the session, we're now going to have a short period of moderated conversation. I would like to give Mike, I'll call you Mike and Michael, just to kind of keep things straight. Give each of these people a chance to respond to what the other has said. And I'll start things off with a question addressed to you, Mike. So the crux of your argument for the moral right to gun ownership seems to be based on the idea of self-defense. And a lot of what Michael said seemed intended to cast doubt on the value of firearms for self-defense, citing statistics that guns were often used against the person who owned them, or people who were trying to defend themselves by guns were more likely to be injured by doing so. So I want to give you a chance to respond to some of those statistics and make the case that guns are in fact valuable to self-defense.
Yeah, so, well, I'm going to comment on the statistic about the gun being 22 times more likely to be used against you or something. So first, note that that study is about shooting someone in self-defense versus being shot. It's not about using the gun in self-defense. Is that an important difference? Actually, yes, right? Gary Kleck's work on self-defense uses suggests that hardly ever do you actually fire the gun. There's almost none of the self-defense uses require actually firing the gun. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because most criminals, like, they're not just, out to have a big fight. They want your stuff or whatever. If they find out you have a gun, they usually do not make you shoot them. They usually leave as soon as they know you have a gun. The other thing is, actually, most of the cases in which you get shot by your own gun are suicides. If you're suicidal, then maybe you shouldn't have a gun. Or maybe you should, because if you want to kill yourself, you might actually consider this a reason to buy a gun, okay? But if you're not suicidal, you probably know that you're not suicidal. So, it's not like you're going to accidentally commit suicide one day, right? You probably know if you're not going to commit suicide, in which case then you're not really at risk, so you can go ahead and buy the gun, right?
Michael, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, all that's true. I think we should tag for further thought the fact that the numbers are sometimes disputed because they're self-report data. You just ask people. It's like these diet studies. You just ask people, how much did you eat yesterday? Like they really know carefully, okay? Asking people, how many times did you brandish your gun? This is not a statistic that's guaranteed that we can count on a video monitor. You're just asking somebody. So, did he just sort of hold it up like that and the criminal ran away? Did he point? Did he shoot in the air? Did he just have a sign out front that says, this house is armed? So on. So that's why the numbers vary so much. You had between 55,000 and 4.5 million. That's quite a standard deviation for a statistic. That tells us that there's something wrong with the data collection technique. Either way, we can't draw a conclusion from that. I would say, Michael, on your original thought experiment, again, the way you present it, it's like, well, yeah, of course, the person should have a right to defend themselves. And again, practically speaking, we're not going to change the Supreme Court decisions anytime soon where all handguns are banned. And as I said, if we did and the feds went out to collect all 300 million guns, it would be Waco every weekend. And no one's proposing that. But what can we do as just again to reduce the carnage? That for every thought experiment like what you presented, I could just say, well, there's another one where the person's kids, friends came over, you've seen this all the time in the news, kids accidentally shoot themselves. Or just, if you want to have an entertaining afternoon, instead of watching cat videos on YouTube, just Google people that accidentally shoot themselves. There's a certain element of tragic comedy, or tragic, Greek comedy tragic to this, because these guys, and they're all guys, they're all wanting to win Darwin Awards, take themselves out of the gene pool early before reproducing. That's how you get a Darwin Award. You've seen, there's Twitter accounts now where you can follow, hold my beer while I jump off this roof kind of thing, and it's all guys. And they all think they're Dirty Harry. That this, I'm gonna kill this motherfucker, and I'm just gonna, bam, and he shoots himself, and they're, oh, mommy, and they go running off. It's just hilarious. Okay, there's a lot of that goes on. There's a lot of people that shouldn't be anywhere near a gun, which is what, hopefully, the gun control restrictions and licensing and so forth, just treat them like cars. at least as like cars.
I think I'm going to be sticking with the cat videos, but Mike, I wonder, so how much distance is there between your position and the position that Michael articulated towards the end of his presentation? Because if the value of guns, if the moral value of guns is primarily based in their utility for self-defense, well, maybe people can defend themselves without assault rifles, without high-capacity magazines, with the kind of background checks that Michael is proposing. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. So the last slide in which you said what you were proposing sort of went by too fast for me to think about. But I want to say that, so, you said nobody was calling for getting rid of handguns. No, that's not true. There are people who are calling for that. So Nicholas Dixon thinks we should ban all handguns, and Jeff McMahon. And actually, there's a reason for that, which is the overwhelming majority of gun deaths are with handguns. So, a lot of what you talked about was a sort of relatively small cases, right? The majority of gun deaths are handguns. They're actually more suicides than homicides. It's a lot of drug-related and gang-related deaths. Mass shootings are a tiny fraction. We shouldn't really be paying attention to that so much. And also, by the way, gun accidents are a tiny fraction of deaths. Guns are not that, well, they're very dangerous if you want to kill someone. They're not that dangerous if you don't. There's only one way to hurt yourself with a gun. You have to be really stupid to do it. It's got to be pointing at you. It's got to be loaded, and you have to pull the trigger. And,
but there's a lot of people that are really dumb.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
But so, they're like swimming pools, for example, are much more dangerous than guns, and which sounds counterintuitive, but the accident rate is significantly higher. Anyway, so I'm not against all laws restricting guns. So I think criminals should not be allowed to have them. We stop that from having, and people who are insane shouldn't have guns. I agree with that. So I would have to think more about sort of more specifics.
What about having cartridges that can hold 100 bullets?
I don't know. I guess I don't have that much of a problem with that. I think that you're.
What's the purpose for having that other than to kill as many people as you possibly can, which is what the military has them for?
You don't have a problem with restrictions on those, or you don't have the problem with owning them?
Well, I don't have a problem with the 100-round magazines, but I wanted to address another thing you said earlier, which was, you can't defend yourself against the government. No, that's not true. There are multiple times if you just look at the history of the last century, there were multiple times in which a government military was defeated by individuals carrying handheld rifles.
You mean other countries like in Cuba or something?
So the United States was defeated in Vietnam by individuals with handheld rifles. The Soviet Union was defeated in Afghanistan. The French were kicked out of Algeria. The function of the more high-powered weapons, it would be to defend yourself against the government, if that was necessary.
Right.
So there's a lot that Mike said here, and feel free to respond to it as you see fit. But one thing that I'm interested in particularly hearing you respond to is this point about mass shootings and the relative rarity of deaths due to mass shootings compared to the relatively commonplace nature of deaths from handguns. If the proposal is simply to ban assault rifles, but to leave the handgun market intact, it seems like you're only going to be putting a drop in the bucket.
Our conclusion of our cover story here, which was really triggered by the Sandy Hook massacre, was that we can't do anything about it. There's too much of a random element to mass public shootings, which is 4 or more people killed in one event. In as much as the decision by the person to do it, there's a certain element of randomness plus mental illness to it, and the fact that there's 300 million guns, and we're not going to solve that problem. I have to say, I made my arguments, and I think they're good, but really, if you want a gun, you want to kill somebody, anybody can do it in America. It's just, and I don't know what to do about that other than enforce the law. What's the point of having laws, even if you can't always enforce them perfectly? At least we should have laws. We live in a society based on laws. We should have those. But if somebody wants to go shoot up a school, it's going to happen. There's really almost, even the idea of arming, every school is armed with armed guards out front. we already know that they're easy to bypass, so you just shoot the guy. You know, you can't be alert 8 hours a day all the time. So I don't know. I don't know how to stop that.
All right, well, at this point, we've got about a half an hour left for the debate, and I'd like to open up the conversation to include the audience as much as possible. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask either or both of our debaters, just indicate that by raising your hand, and I'll run out to you with a microphone, and I'll do my Phil Donahue impersonation.
I think I'd like to get up at 10,000 feet elevation and kind of look down. I was shocked about 2.5 years ago when I read for the first time that America has 5% of the world's population. We all know that. We also have 25% of the incarcerated people of the world in our jails in this country. Something is wrong. And I believe our treatment of society and criminals and guns and all these things need revamping. Just because of what I said at 10,000 feet. I have tried to tell people that obviously the NRA wants to defend the use of any gun. Since the Constitution, Amendment number 2 says we can arm ourselves, as you pointed out, it doesn't say how we should arm ourselves or could arm ourselves. So it seems to me that maybe a compromise here between all the parties could be that we would issue handguns. I'm talking about handguns now versus rifles. Let the NRA have their rifles. They're macho, outside type people who want to shoot guns and at birds and animals and all that. Fine. So we'll keep rifles, but we only allow licensed security type people, employees, whatever, to have a handgun. So we're still adhering to the Constitution where we can arm ourselves, and I believe we can defeat the NRA, let them have their rifles, because they have mostly rifles as opposed to handguns. So why isn't that a solution?
Should I answer that? Well, the main thing for self-defense is handguns, and especially if you're outside the home. So, like if you live in a dangerous neighborhood and you want to carry a weapon outside the home, it would be a handgun. Nobody would walk around with a rifle.
That's part of my point. We're crying out loud.
Right.
Well, but so maybe I didn't understand the question, but I mean, was a question like, oh, what's wrong with taking handguns away from almost everyone? What's wrong is that would prevent people who want to defend themselves. And the criminals will probably violate that law. And the non-criminals will mostly follow it. So it will actually just help the criminals.
Yeah, except, again, it's just this argument in a narrow case, this one, that the criminals will then do whatever they want. This would be true in any part of life. Bank fraud. Well, why have laws against bank fraud? Because the criminals aren't going to obey those laws. Well, we have to have laws so we can have some kind of regulation and control these industries so that the criminals don't take over. So again, that's the 10,000 foot elevation of what we've been doing for the last 5 centuries, is civilizing people by having a set of laws that everybody gets a copy of, and there is a set of punishments for violating them and so forth. That's the whole point of having that. The fact that it's not perfect, we have so many criminals locked up, that's not really related to guns so much, I think, as it is to bad drug laws. But even those were implemented. So for 5, 6, 7 centuries, we've had this kind of steady decline in the rate of homicides in European countries and then America. And then in the 60s, it kicked back up and just roared along, climbing until about 1993, and then it's been going down ever since 1993 until 2015. There was a little uptick because of certain cities like Chicago where they saw an increase in homicides. But the overall trend has been a decline of violence across the board in all kinds of crimes and assaults and violence and so forth. mainly because of the fact that people have become more civilized. Now, in parts of the country where democracy was slow to come, the rule of law was slow to get there, or in parts of, say, the South where, say, the African American community doesn't trust the law, and for good reason, they take the law into their own hands because people want justice. And so when you take the law into your own hands, violence goes back up. So again, just tweaking the incentive matrix by having better laws, that's what we have to keep doing.
So could I comment on the bank fraud example? So, I mean, the difference between the gun laws and bank fraud laws is bank fraud is something that you don't want anyone to do. But with the gun laws, it's specifically you want to take the guns away from certain people. Like you want ordinary people to have them, but you want this especially dangerous people who are prone to commit other crimes to not have them. Right.
So my question is for you specifically, what about your thoughts on the CDC studying this, or kind of to your point you're making right now, you look at like car dust, and then we put seatbelts in, and we have speed limits and all that kind of stuff. Just educating and training and having licensing. What are your thoughts on just kind of improving our knowledge and the experience of those gun owners?
Yeah, sounds good to me. I mean, the NRA has actually done a lot to sort of educate their members about gun safety, which is why gun accidents are much less common now than they used to be. Obviously, there's no problem with people learning, but I think if you think that that's going to make a big difference, you're probably overly optimistic. There's already been quite a lot of study, and you just get people with different orientations coming to different conclusions when they study the issue, right? So I mean, it's not going to be resolved by just having more people doing more studies.
Well, but more knowledge, data, that's what science is all about. That's what propels civilization forward, is by understanding the cause of things. Then we can decide what to do from there.
So raise your hands if you want questions, just to have a sense of the room here.
I want to come back to something you said about people who buy a gun because they want to kill themselves. 22,000 suicides. You say, well, they just want to kill themselves, so let them have a gun. So when you think about the fact that suicide is a temporary condition and shooting yourself with a gun is a permanent solution, when you think about 22,000 lives that are full of promises and that are gone, so suddenly and without any remedy, when you think about 22,000 families that are shattered by something that was entirely preventable, can you speak a little more about these 22,000 deaths that are preventable?
So I think there are two kinds of, basically there are two kinds of people who attempt suicide. There are the people who really want to be dead, and then there are the people for whom it's a kind of cry for help or something. The people who really want to be dead are more likely to take more deadly methods, like a gun. And those people probably have a worse problem, which is not going to be solved by taking the gun away from them. Okay, now, probably they need psychological care, right, which they're not going to get by gun control laws or whatever, okay? But I don't think that it's the job of the government to restrict people's freedom in order to prevent some people from harming themselves. Like restrict the freedom of everyone because some people might harm themselves. I think that's sort of overstepping the government's authority. The job of the government, I think, is to prevent people from violating each other's rights, not to stop you from harming yourself, and certainly not to violate other people's rights in order to stop you from harming yourself.
So you would be in favor of legalizing most or not, if not all, drugs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a libertarian, not a conservative.
Yeah. So I have strong libertarian leanings too, although I've taken to calling myself a classical liberal because it sounds better. Although as I get older and I become a little more, I guess, sensitive to human nature and the dark side, the inner demons and the bad things people do, we really need laws. We really do. People. Let me address the suicide thing though before I lose that thought. So there's a new book that came out this week by Jesse Bering. He's a psychologist, Jesse Bering, B-E-R-I-N-G. It's called Suicidal. So he summarizes all the research on suicide of what we know now from a cognitive science perspective. And the hard answer is we don't know why people kill themselves. We really don't. I mean, so, well, depression. Most depressed people don't kill themselves. Okay, so, but a lot of people who do kill themselves were depressed. Yes, that's right. But it's just one of many variables. It looks like a lot of people go through ups and downs, and then they have a crisis moment, and they don't even know that it's coming. They may wake up that morning, and by the afternoon, they've decided, I'm going to do it. They don't even know why they decided at that moment. And the reason we know this is because there's a data set now of people that tried to kill themselves and failed, and they told us this. Like, I had no idea. I just woke up and went, okay, today's the day. And boy, am I glad I failed, because wow, I don't know what came over me. I lost my mind. I'm so glad that so-and-so was there to save me, or I didn't take the right pills or whatever. And you don't get that option with guns. So I think this is a huge element there for controlling that. And then that's why the suicide hotline is super important. If you just get over that little peak there, that little trough maybe that you're in for just an hour or two, that may be all it is. And then, again, you have a full life ahead of you. The gun prevents that from happening.
Yes, this question's for the professor. I'm just curious as to your opinion about, we see the statistics about the dangers of people owning a firearm and it being used against them or themselves shooting themselves, or somebody else taking the gun and then using it against the person, injuring or killing them. And with the statistics showing that that is so much more likely to happen than their potential need to use their weapon for self-defense, why do you think people persist in wanting to keep that weapon in their home? Is it just our American gun culture that they're buying into and feel like, well, everybody's done this for decades in this country?
Well, so the statistics don't show that. That's what anti-gun people say, or that's the sort of spin on it. But as I mentioned a little earlier, the statistic isn't about how often a gun is used for self-defense. It's about how often you shot someone in self-defense. And most self-defense uses don't require shooting someone. So you're a lot more likely to use the gun in self-defense than to have it used against you. But when you do, you probably won't shoot anyone, because the criminal will probably leave you alone as soon as he finds out that you have a gun. Right? I mean, what you really asked was sort of a psychological question, like, oh, why do people get guns for self-defense? Well, because a lot of people are afraid, and it makes you less afraid because it's a lot easier to defend yourself with this weapon, right? So, and it's very easy to use. Like almost anyone can use it. You don't have to be strong or skilled or whatever. And frequently you're threatened by somebody who is a lot stronger than you, right? And you figure this is the only way you're going to defend yourself, right?
That's certainly the case with drug dealers. Because drugs are illegal, there's a black market instead of a free market. And where there's a black market, you can't go to the judge if your co-dealer broke the contract that you had and sue them, because everything you're doing is illegal. So you have to take the law into your own hands. So you got to have a gun to defend yourself or settle scores and so on. So the drug laws lead to a big spike in homicides, gun-related homicides, because of this self-help justice issue.
Hands again for those of you who wanted to ask a question. Try moving around the room a bit.
I have a quick question about your sort of libertarian approach to the gun issue, especially the negative rights kind of approach. So if you have a right to defend yourself, and yet, since you're worried with the actual facts and statistics, presumably if we had the data that said overwhelmingly there are laws that would solve the problem, you would accept that numbers matter? Like, it's not just we have inviolable negative rights, and anything that actually conflicts with our negative rights to protect our lives, our stuff, our property, our whatever, you would accept that there are sort of benefits that could trump rights, even if we end up infringing negative rights by taking people's guns away?
Right, yeah. So I don't think rights are absolute. That is, it's possible to be justified in violating a right.
Okay, then my real question is, when you talk about self-defense, is it self-defense of your life or anything, your property being violated in any way, such that when you point out the statistics about whether a gun is brandished versus shot or whatever, if most of the time you wouldn't have been killed, but maybe your stuff would have been taken, is that included in your justification for not taking guns away from people? That's my main question.
Yeah, basically, yes. So I think if you have a right, just in general, whatever, a right to whatever, then you have a right to defend that thing if somebody's threatening it. Right, so I mean, obviously, like what you can do to defend the right depends upon how important the right is. So you can shoot somebody to prevent yourself from being seriously injured. You can't shoot somebody just to stop them from taking your stereo or something like that. You can maybe threaten to shoot someone to stop them from taking your stereo, but you can't actually do it, right? But don't tell them that you think that. Right?
Don't shoot them in the back.
Many of the discussions I hear talk about these proposals to modify gun control laws. And in your slide, you had things like ban assault weapons or ban high-capacity magazines. And a lot of people might think that that's reasonable. But people in the past have acted in good faith under this existing set of laws. And suppose they have invested in recreational activities or something legal. I never hear the other side of the argument, so I'd like to hear you address that. Is that a taking? Do I have to turn the rifle in to be crushed? Does the government owe a responsibility to buy those from us?
Well, in
How does that
Australia,
work?
that's what they did. It was a buyback program. But, Australia, much smaller population, far fewer guns, more willingness of the populace to do it. This was after a mass public shooting in 1996. And I had a whole bunch of slides about the Australian law, what happened after that, all good news. But we're not Australia. Again, realistically speaking, I don't see this happening here. I think, the feeling I get from talking to pro-gun people is they wouldn't care if it was 1 million people a year who died by gun. I want my gun. It's my right. Okay.
I would agree with that.
What?
Americans are not giving up their guns, okay? So, like if semi-automatic rifles were banned, we're not giving them up.
Do you own a gun?
Yep.
You do? What do you have?
All right. Let's not go into that.
Okay, all right. You're not packing right now, are you?
No.
Okay.
I was thinking maybe I should do that to show how perfectly safe it is, but no. And people would freak out.
Okay, hello. My question is directed to Dr. Shermer. Something I'd like to point out, this is in the DC versus Heller case. This is a quote, this is what Justice Scalia said, that we can regulate dangerous and unusual weapons, but not weapons in common use, meaning that the suggestion isn't that you can own a tank or anything like that, but that you can own weapons that are within the common use of citizens, which would include semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and shotguns, things like that. But aside from that, don't you think that this has a lot less to do with guns and a lot more to do with a person's socioeconomic status? Because this is according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. In America, in households struggling with poverty, or not struggling with poverty, middle to high income families have anywhere between 0.8 to 2.5 firearm homicides per 1,000 people. Households struggling with poverty have 3.5 per 1,000 people. So don't you think there's more of a correlation between things like poverty, single motherhood, things like that, that contribute to violence, not just gun violence, but violence in general, and that you could apply that logic to other countries as well? It's not necessarily that more guns equals less crime. It's mainly a problem of the culture and people's, poverty and single motherhood and things like that. Don't you think that's more of a problem?
Well, it's one factor, for sure. Any complex social issue like guns, you're going to have multivariate analysis where there's lots of factors at play. if you're in a country like in Germany, for example, or Japan, there's just no guns. Almost nobody has guns. In Germany, if you want a gun, you're interviewed. What do you want it for? Well, I'm a hunter. You can leave it and lock it up at the hunting lodge, and you can pick it up when you go hunting. That's it. Next. So there you're not going to see those kinds of socioeconomic class differences when there's just no guns. Here, I don't know that particular study, and it's per 100,000, not 1,000, I think, that it's probably related to lower socioeconomic class neighborhoods have more crime, therefore people are more likely to have to take the law into their own hands because the law is not operating effectively or fairly in those neighborhoods. Here I recommend Heather McDonald's book, The War on Cops. She's the one who coined the term the Ferguson effect, which may apply to Chicago, that little uptick I talked about in the homicides in Chicago. The police stopped getting out of their cars. They stopped doing active policing where from these computer programs that the intersection of this street and that street, it's 5 times more likely to be a crime there. Park the squad car there, get out of the car and talk to people, and the crime rates go down. Because the Ferguson effect, that is, every time a cop gets out of the car, they're being videotaped. A lot of these cops just said, that's it, I'm not getting out of the car, I'm not going to do active policing anymore because I might get fired. So the criminals then are essentially coming back into play in that formula. So I suspect that's probably, if that's a true statistic, probably accounts for that.
So we have time for a couple of more questions.
One up front.
I have an observation to make, and then I'd like you to comment. I know that you, on the right side, are from New York City. Is that right?
I'm from New York City? No, I'm from Southern California.
Oh, you're from Southern California?
Yeah, I know.
All right, and you
Hard to
are
believe.
from...
So I live in Denver.
All right.
Yeah.
So maybe you aren't aware of the situation all along the southern border, where the Border Patrol do their best to avoid conflict with the criminal activity of the cartels bringing people and guns or drugs across the border. They face greater firepower with the criminals, and they're not all cartel members, but criminal gangs. Now that means that all the people who live across the southern border are in an environment where if they're property owners and if they're homeowners and they need some self-defense, they need weapons. Now you said, who needs a cartridge that holds 100 bullets? I think you should do a poll of the ranchers and farmers just along the southern border, and they will tell you why they carry high-powered magazines all the time in their trucks, in their cars.
Okay. Right.
And you can leave the southern border and go into other ranching territory where MS-13 has its gangs working, and the ranchers and the property owners will tell you why they are armed and not with pellet guns.
No BB guns?
So I welcome your comment.
No, it's a perfectly good example. But isn't that the problem of enforcing the laws of immigration and border patrol and so on that all countries have? For some reason, I think it's pretty obvious why, America's become the focus of immigration controversies and debates, but all countries have restrictions, and ours is not even remotely close to the most restrictive immigration policy in the world. And so it's just a matter of enforcing the laws that exist. Now,
Those laws aren't enforced at all.
well, other countries they are.
Immigration laws in the U.S.?
No, I'm saying that the problem is enforce the laws. That's the problem. They're not being enforced. Okay, so now I lost my train of thought because you yelled at me. Okay, so I mean, so it's a perfectly good example. But again, it's almost like you're arguing just arm everybody and the hell with the law. Everybody just shoot it out and we'll see how it all sorts out. This is the exact opposite of what we should be doing in civil society. Yeah, well, I mean, but that's kind of if I carry out that thought experiment, then, arm everybody to the, okay. Also, if you legalize the drugs, then the cartels wouldn't have any economic power because the pharmaceuticals could sell those drugs at a higher quality, lower price without the criminal element. But that's a separate debate that we'd probably be on the same side.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I would say, okay, wait until that happens, and then you can talk about restricting the guns.
To me, 300 million guns is a failure of government. And to me, we shouldn't allow another failure of government by allowing assault weapons. There's no need for them. And it will only make this country more dangerous for everybody. Your thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, so when people ask me, like, why would anyone need assault weapons, liberals don't like my answer, but you would need them to defend against the government. Like that's why you would need military-style rifles. And as discussed previously, well, if there was a tyrannical government, yes, you could use handheld rifles against them, because the U.S. government has in fact been defeated in that way in Vietnam, for example. And the other thing I wanted to say was, for people who think that the government would never hurt them and everybody should trust the government, I should remind you that governments change over time. Remind you that Nazi Germany was a democracy, or Germany was a democracy just before it became Nazi Germany. And I would remind you that something over 100 million people were killed by their own governments in the 20th century. It's not counting, governments killing people in other countries, right? I don't know how many people total were killed by non-government killers, right? But it was certainly an enormous number of people being killed by their own governments. And really, you should think that this is a very serious threat.
Some liberals have become more receptive to that idea in the last couple of years, I think. We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
So there's been some talk with defining handguns, semi-automatic weapons, and military-grade weapons. One of the issues are bump stocks, so this is open to the both of you. Do you think there should be a ban on bump stocks?
Yes, but I don't think it's going to happen. And even if it did, I think there'd be a black market for it.
Sorry, what is that?
Bump stocks.
What are bump stocks?
Oh, the things you can put on a rifle to make it automatic from semi-automatic, so you don't have to pull the trigger. You buy it online. You bolt it onto the rifle, and instead of having to pull the trigger each time, the recoil causes the trigger to be pulled automatically.
I see. Yeah. I wouldn't ban those either, but I don't think that's a particularly important thing, right? I mean, The people who are concerned about murder actually should be focused on handguns, right? They're these sort of exotic type of weapon things that have almost no role, like they're hardly ever used, and it's just sort of an emotional appeal because when you think about it, it sounds scary, right? But if you're actually trying to prevent murders, actually you have to think about handguns.
One last question.
Michael made some comment earlier in his presentation about the number of times guns were used to prevent crimes exceeded, he thought, the number of times those gun crimes, I believe, were actually perpetrated. Now, that the first category could include people intending to prevent a crime by using a gun and shooting himself or his spouse, etc. Would you please clarify that comment, because I find it rather hard to believe that more crimes were prevented with a gun than that were actually perpetrated with a gun.
So clarify my comment. So there are studies of defensive gun uses. The way they go is it's a survey, right? So they call and ask people questions about whether they used a gun for self-defense. And you get different estimates from different studies, okay? But the high estimates imply that there's a very large number of defensive gun uses. Typically, the defensive gun use requires you to have actually seen a person who you thought was committing or attempting to commit a crime against you, and to have done something with a gun, but not necessarily to have fired it. We don't know how many of these actually occur because there are widely varying estimates, and also because it's a rare event, it's difficult to get an accurate estimate, right? So you get like just a very small number of people in the survey saying that they had a defensive gun use, and then you have to kind of multiply it to estimate for the whole country, right? But it might be much larger than the number of gun crimes. Yeah, so when I say that there might be more defensive gun uses than gun crimes, for the crimes I would be looking at just like the FBI's crime reports, right? Like the number of crimes that they have recorded. Yeah. No, but so I say, so I'm taking the crime statistics from the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, and so you might think that those are underestimated. In fact, they might be underestimated, almost certainly underestimated, because there are a lot of unreported crimes, okay? But there are probably a lot more, like the FBI doesn't have statistics on defensive gun uses, so that's why you have to go to the survey. Now, you'd be right that like both of these are flawed methods of estimating the number, right? When you just call people on the phone, like, well, maybe some people are lying. Maybe some people have sort of misremembered when the incident occurred, so they're supposed to report for the last year, but they might be reporting an earlier episode. Also, some of the crimes might be unreported, right? But by the way, it's not the case that you only report a crime if a gun was fired, right? If you were robbed, that's normally in the crime reports, right?
Michael, did you want anything to that?
Oh, well, just as kind of a general reflection on gun studies, it's really complicated. I'm a social scientist by training, and so when I undertook to read the literature on guns, I was amazed at how complex a lot of these studies are and how many variables are at work at any one time. And you can kind of get the numbers come out almost any way you want by controlling for this variable instead of that variable. And 50 different states, we have 50 different kinds of laws about guns and so on, plus federal laws. And so you can compare, this state to that state or this region to that region, or homes that have guns versus homes that don't have guns and so on. And it's amazing how different positions come out, and they all have numbers. And it's really hard to get your mind around it. I think the National Research Council that you cited is pretty reliable. And I just think we need more research that's reliable on that. But it's a hard problem.
And that's a great note on which to end our conversation, actually. I hope that if nothing else, you walk away from this debate tonight with an appreciation of just how complicated this issue is, and perhaps with more of an appreciation of what the other side, whatever the other side might be for you, has to say on this topic. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I want to remind you about our survey. If you could take a few moments to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. And I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our debaters who've done a terrific job exploring this issue with us. We have somebody, I had somebody who's going to make a few comments. Just request your help with the project.